Hi, friends. Welcome to the Full and Thriving podcast. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, and if you're here, it means you're ready for some aha moments that will inspire you to create a more vibrant, authentic life that's full of joyful moments, deeper connections, inner peace, and courageous action towards your dreams. Let's get started. Hello, friends. Welcome to another solo show of the Full and Thriving podcast. And today we are going to be talking about boundaries, which is a topic that I have had on my mind for 4 years. And I have never had a single episode based solely on this topic. And the main reason for that is because it is an overwhelming topic with so much to share. And today I'm going to dive into all of it. So I want you to ask yourself these questions to see if you can relate to the concept of boundaries and unhealthy boundaries. So are you currently in a situation where you're feeling resentful, overwhelmed, disrespected, or undervalued? Do you feel taken for granted at all? Does a specific relationship dynamic make you feel drained? Are you constantly putting yourself in a situation where someone is disrespecting you? All of these feelings that you have inside might be a sign that you need to set a boundary. In this episode, we will be diving into everything you need to know about boundaries, what they are and why they're important and how to set them. We will also be talking about the signs of an unhealthy boundary and what healthy boundaries look and feel like. You'll also hear some personal stories from me about boundaries that I've failed to set and boundaries that have transformed the outcome of my life. The truth is, I really didn't know anything about boundaries until my late 20s. So if you're sitting here totally confused, feeling like, how have I gone my whole life without boundaries? Don't worry. Everyone learned this at different times. And I'll tell you, when I failed to set a major boundary was when I finally figured them out. And I will get into that in a minute. The best definition I found online about boundaries is one by Melissa Urban, the author of the book of Boundaries. And she says that boundaries mark the limits of behavior that are acceptable to you, where words or actions beyond that action cause you harm and make you feel unsafe. So boundaries are not used to tell someone what to do or what not to do, because that would really be controlling. Boundaries are established to help you plan and communicate your response to what other people do. So again, a boundary marks the limits of behavior that are acceptable to you. Okay. So anything beyond that boundary, you are not okay with, and it is not acceptable. So the whole point of a boundary is communicating this to someone and you planning how you would respond if someone did not rise up to the boundary and meet you where you're at and honor that boundary. We are not trying to manipulate or control anyone when setting a boundary. So the truth is, now that I know how to set boundaries, I truly love them. And the coolest part about boundaries is that they require a deep sense of self-worth and knowing your values through and through. They really require clarity on what your needs are, what matters to you, and total courage in setting them. So again, they're not about controlling anyone or demanding something of others. They're actually very neutral, and they're actually all about protecting your energy, your sense of peace, respect, and safety in a relationship or situation. Boundaries are not about changing someone else. It's about communicating how you will respond to people or situations that make you feel uncomfortable. I think setting a boundary is very courageous and it's a super vulnerable thing to do. And it's a bit of a risk because there's a chance that you might be rejected. But at the very least, I do think setting a boundary will show you a person's true intentions and feelings about the relationship or situation you're currently in. So, like I said, it's not about manipulation or changing someone's behavior. It's about being clear on how you will respond. Let me share with you about a boundary I failed to set that really gave me years of distress. So, back when I was 26, I started dating my ex before Dan. And we had a very exciting start to our relationship. We were falling in love, and I was convinced he was the one. But after a few months of dating, he expressed that he had plans to move from Connecticut to Colorado and brought up the idea of me moving out there with him. It was actually like a really kind gesture. However, deep down, I did not want to move to Colorado, but I wasn't looking at the situation clearly. The thing is, I did not want to move to Colorado. I had never even been there before. And I especially didn't want to live with someone for the first time without a serious commitment in the relationship, like an engagement. I was raised very traditionally. This was something that was a value of mine that I really thought I cared about. However, I was super afraid of losing him and being rejected by him. So in that moment, I completely gaslit myself and told myself that everyone moves in with their partner before an engagement. This is just a sign of the times. This is expected. It would be super weird if I didn't live with him before an engagement. And I had to just be chill about it. That's what everyone does, especially in the Northeast, I guess. So I continued to tell myself lies. I said, I could adjust to Colorado. I'll be happy living anywhere. And honestly, I've been so good at being the chill girl that I could do this before. I mean, that I've done this before and I could do this again. So after all the gaslighting, I agreed to move out to Colorado. However, when I made that decision to actually move there, I started having emotional breakdowns, panic attacks before I even packed my bags. I would start arguments about it and I felt really uncomfortable. So I realized that I should probably try to express my need for an engagement before I move out there. So one night on the phone, I attempted to express my need for an engagement before moving in together. And he responded with a lot of resistance and accused me of strong arming the situation, essentially forcing it. And I didn't want to be viewed in that way. I wanted to be chill. I could tell I would lose him if I enforced this boundary. I didn't even have the words for it at the time, but I could tell I would lose him if I stuck to my guns. So I pushed my needs aside completely, ended up moving across the country to a place I had never been with a person who wasn't even prioritizing marriage. And for 4 years, I was miserable and we constantly fought about our timeline when we would get engaged and married. And I tell you, I feel like I was rotting from the inside out with shame and resentment. We ended the relationship, and I'll tell you, without that experience, I wouldn't have learned so much about boundaries and the importance of recognizing and understanding and clearly communicating my needs. So what did I do wrong in that situation? First of all, I completely pushed my needs under a rug and minimized them. And I let the fear of rejection prevent me from enforcing my boundary and sticking to my values. Anyway, that's my story that helped me realize the importance of boundaries. I had to learn them the hard way. And in a few minutes, I'll share a boundary that completely transformed and elevated my life that I set after that experience. So let's get back to the educational part of this episode. Now, I want to run through a list of signs of unhealthy boundaries with examples. And when I'm explaining these, I'd like for you to check in with yourself and see if you're experiencing any of these for yourself in your own life. So, first example here, first sign that there are unhealthy boundaries in your life. Do you have difficulty saying no? Do you think the word no is a bad word? I know that people who are pretty bad at creating healthy boundaries feel a lot of guilt over the word no. Also, do you over-involve yourself in other people's problems? Do you try to solve everything for everyone else? Next, do you take too much responsibility for other people? Are you the person who takes on all the work and thinks that the world is going to come to an end when you say no and say you're overwhelmed? Do you overshare personal information inappropriately? Do you accept rude or disrespectful treatment consistently from other people? Do you fear rejection or loss of others if you do not comply to their standards or their rules? And finally, do you feel a sense of pride for being selfless and having no needs to the point of having no true sense of self? Those are all signs that you might have unhealthy boundaries in your life. So now let's go over the signs of healthy boundaries. First of all, you feel comfortable and confident saying no, and you have no fear of the repercussions of saying no to others. Do you feel like your boundaries are respected and honored by other people? Are you aware of your wants, needs, and values? And do you have the ability to clearly and directly communicate those in a respectful way? I think a lot of people are very aware of their needs and what they value, but when it comes to the communication, they shrivel up and shrink and become small. When really, when communicating your boundaries, you need to have a presence, you need to have confidence, and you need to be direct. So, do you have the courage to enforce boundaries even when it's hard? That's another one. And finally, if your boundary is violated, do you distance yourself or change the relationship appropriately? Because I know many people set boundaries over and over and over again and let people continue to bulldoze those boundaries to the point where the boundary doesn't really matter, and the person who constantly violates the boundary doesn't have any consequences for their action. And finally, a really good idea of a healthy boundary or good sign is that even though you have these boundaries, you are not closed off to the world. You're actually open to intimacy and connection with others. So thinking about yourself, thinking about everything I shared, where do you fall on that line? Are you experiencing healthy or unhealthy boundaries in your life? Maybe a mix of both. But don't worry, I'm about to explain how to set healthy boundaries in 1 minute. But I wanted to share with you another example of a boundary that transformed my life. And this boundary was put in place when I started dating my now husband, Dan. So when we started dating, there was a discussion pretty early on around moving together. And this made me feel super nervous given my previous experience 5 years prior, right? So I found myself in the same exact situation, talking to someone I really loved about living with each other. And I was terrified because I still felt like I was going against the grain. Seems like everyone in the world was living with their partners, and this was probably going to be Dan's expectation too. But I had learned after years of living with someone without being engaged that this was not something that made me feel safe. It did not make me feel aligned with my values. It brought out this really insecure side of me. And I did not want to get into a situation where I was wasting my time again and feeling like I was a car being test drove for several years. I honestly felt like that. It comes from years of like a very traditional upbringing. And yeah, so I can unpack that another time, but I still felt very nervous going into this conversation. So when Dan and I, one night, we had this really intimate, loving conversation, and the topic of moving in together was brought up. And I took a deep breath, felt like I was jumping off a cliff. And I said to him that I was unwilling to put myself in that situation again. And therefore, I did not want to move in with him until he was willing to propose and we could be engaged, because I wanted a stronger level of commitment in order to move in with someone. And especially in my 30s, like I wanted to have children. I didn't want to waste any time. So I calmly explained to him my previous experience, the emotions around it, even how vulnerable I was feeling. I expressed how much I cared about him, but I stood strong in my true belief that I was not going to be living with him until we were engaged. I would happily live with my parents and date him until we were ready to take that commitment and then move in with each other after the fact. And thankfully, Dan is such an open-minded person, and he truly was falling in love with me at that point too, that I think even though he told me he believed that people should live with each other first, he thought that was the natural progression, as does most people in the world. At least I live in New England. Most people think moving in together is the right next step. So that was his belief. So we had a discussion around his thoughts around that belief. I did not change my mind. I did not waver. He was super open and understanding. And it only took one conversation with the love of my life for him to understand the boundary. He was clear on it. He respected my boundary. And within maybe one day of thinking about it, he met me where I was and said, you know what? This is completely acceptable. I know your background. I know where you're coming from. I want the same things in life as you do. So I'm okay with moving forward in our relationship this way. It took one brave conversation for me to set this boundary with the right person who responded in a loving, open way. And I gotta say, it was truly terrifying, because when I had this conversation, I said I felt like I had been jumping off a cliff. And that's because of the vulnerability of being rejected in that moment. Dan could have completely turned around and been like, this girl is asking for way too much, way too soon. I'm not ready. He could have said, this is a requirement for me and I'm inflexible about it. And then we would have been incompatible and we would have had to end the relationship. And I was fully willing to walk away if that was the case. And that's what was so scary, because I did love him. And I will say, I was willing to walk away because I knew after years of therapy that if someone is unwilling to respect your boundaries or they're unwilling to meet you where you're at, it's just a sign they're not the right person for you at that moment. And so, that would have been terrible. That would have been totally devastating. But thankfully, it all worked out. So I feel like I was really rolling the dice there, but I was willing to value myself and put my needs first instead of push them under the rug and minimize them, which had put me in a terrible situation back in the day. So let's go back to that educational piece. Let's apply some of these lessons I learned into your life. How do you set a boundary? First of all, this is my favorite part about boundaries. You have to know yourself in and out in order to begin setting one. So you need to identify the need for the boundary. And this requires checking in with your feelings. Maybe you have been feeling uncomfortable about the way someone has been treating you or the expectations placed on you. Maybe you feel worn out or taken for granted. You should ask yourself, what do I need to feel better in this situation? What feels unfair to me? What needs to change so I can feel at peace? What can I do to restore the balance in this situation? So, this first step of identifying your needs is so important because it will help you align with your values and your sense of peace. And you have to get clear on this. And that's why I love boundaries. You cannot set a boundary without being clear on where you stand on the situation. So many of us avoid checking in with ourselves. That's really a huge part of step one. Step two is firmly and kindly and respectfully communicate the boundary. You can have a really loving discussion in this moment. You can listen to the other person's perspective. They can listen to your perspective. However, you need to be firm. And in the case with Dan, I had to be super brave, and I was risking rejection, loss of a relationship, heartbreak. And I also knew that this could cause potential conflict. It was a lot, but I still had to communicate it. It is gutsy. Communicating a boundary is gutsy. It is not for the faint of heart. And I want to emphasize the importance of kindness and respect. I do not want you to go setting a boundary where you're insulting the person or disrespecting them or pointing a finger at them or trying to push them towards your perspective. It is not about communicating and forcing. It's about communicating and letting go. Okay, that's what a boundary is all about. It's communicating your needs, maybe why they're important, and letting go. It is a true Hail Mary move. You have to throw that football, cross your fingers that that person's going to catch it. And if not, you might not get the outcome that you hope for. However, you learn a lot about the situation and you save yourself a lot of stress and emotional energy drain, because that's what happens when boundaries are violated. So after you have identified the need for the boundary, communicated kindly and firmly, the next piece of the puzzle is the most important, and that is that you must enforce the boundary. And when it came to Dan, like I said, I was terrified, but I was prepared to come to the realization and the truth that we were incompatible. Okay. That is a neutral thing, right? Incompatibility is actually pretty neutral. It just means this relationship is not going to work for both of us because it is misaligned with our values and our needs, right? So I was prepared to enforce this boundary, and I knew how painful it was going to feel, and it was truly terrifying. However, when you are enforcing your boundary, just keep in mind that your needs and your values are important, and you are setting yourself up for feeling so much lighter and more free and more expansive when you can honor yourself in this way. So I think this is where the majority of people fail with setting boundaries, is actually following through. So what people do is they typically will state a boundary, but they do not follow through on changing how the relationship looks if that person continuously disrespects them. So unfortunately, this is the hardest part. It requires a lot of courage and strength to stand strong and say, I've articulated what's important to me, and I've articulated how I will respond if this happens again or if this continues to happen. I've only observed that you're continuously disrespecting this boundary, and therefore I will have to pull back from this relationship or this situation in certain ways, right? This could be personal, it could be professional, and you just have to calmly and coolly state that. And that is the scariest part, but that is part of the boundary setting situation. So that's how you do it. You identify the boundary, you communicate kindly and respectfully, and then you enforce the boundary. You have to change the relationship if that person or situation cannot meet you where you're at. So, as we close this episode about boundaries, I want to leave you with a few helpful reminders. First and foremost, boundaries are neutral. They are not mean unless you communicate them in a rude and disrespectful or insulting way. You can be kind and respectful and communicate boundaries at the same time. They can coexist. Also, boundaries are not manipulative, okay? So that's when it turns into an ultimatum, right? And I think that's the hardest part is sometimes you have a boundary and people view it as an ultimatum because they have this negative connotation around, oh, this person's trying to force me into this situation. But that's not what it is. Ultimatums are about harnessing control and keeping control, right? A boundary is saying, hey, if my needs are not being met in this situation, I'm willing to let go. And it's actually a really beautiful, peaceful thing to do. So they're vulnerable, they're self-preserving, but they are not manipulative. And finally, boundaries require knowing yourself. So the self-development work, self-discovery work, therapy, all of it's so important when getting to identify the boundaries that are important in your life. And finally, you must be courageous to set a boundary. A boundary can transform your life into something beautiful. You just have to have the courage to do it. And this can be a huge challenge, but I truly believe deep down you can do it. I hope my personal stories inspire you and give you strength to stand strong in your beliefs and what matters to you, because you matter. Your needs matter. It is okay to stand strong in that. And I have faith that if you do, your life will be 10 million bajillion times better. So that's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for being here and listening to the Full and Thriving podcast. And I am signing off with a reminder for all of you. Life is what you make of it. Keep listening to your inner voice. Keep taking courageous actions towards the life you want, and you will be happier and more free. All right, that's it, everyone. I appreciate you being here. Mwah! All right, have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you next time on the Full and Thriving podcast. All right, that concludes this week's episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the show. When you have a moment, please head on over to Instagram and follow my recovery coaching account at Meg_McCabe to stay up to date on everything I'm doing in recovery land. And if you're feeling extra inspired, please send me a direct message to let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.